So first, Nikia, you can't hear. Okay, let me answer this. There should be a mic you can unmute. Okay. So if you haven't done it yet, please go to the email that I sent you all and just download your partner list. Okay. I don't know the logistics of having me talk to you or having you all talk to each other while I'm doing a lecture right now. But after class, I'd like you to do that, and then you can report back to me on this. So some of you, if you're in my strength and conditioning class, I might have already gone over self-determination theory. So some of the things that we will be moving forward on is more of a coaching approach. So the self-determination theory is one theory that I think is really beneficial for coaches to understand because it can help people really improve what's called their intrinsic motivation. So just a few things. Anyone can do any behavior once. We've already established that in class. So for example, with exercise, anyone could go to the gym, anyone could go for a walk, anyone could go for a jog one time. But the health benefits of exercise are not, they're not immediate. They're cumulative and distal. So that means that you need to if we're talking about exercise, you need to be exercising many times across a long period of time to actually see some serious health benefits. So again, anyone can do one behavior. So single behaviors aren't necessarily the issue. What the real issue is going to be maintenance. Okay, so maintenance of behavior. So as a coach, how can we take a hook? So like what that one person's initial motive that did drive a single behavior. So if someone comes to you and they're like, I want to lose weight, or I want to exercise more, or I want to start drinking less or quit smoking, how can we make that take that one single motive and help it contribute to actual long-term behavior and maintenance? I was just reading something earlier today where I believe it took a smoker on average 30 attempts to quit smoking for at least 1 year. So that means people try things, but how do we get to that maintenance phase? Okay, so what we're going to cover today is we're going to identify and describe what psychological needs are in self-determination theory. And we're going to learn the differences between controlled and autonomous motivation. And we're going to learn how providing basic psychological needs can help people improve their autonomous motivation. And then we're also going to assess ways to apply these self-determination theory concepts to actually coaching. And I'm doing that through an exercise lens. So when I had originally done this lecture, it was for a presentation, and I had asked some of the former athletes that I trained, like what it meant to have coaches that actually cared about you. And this was one of my athletes. This was a basketball player. So I asked him what it meant to have coaches that cared about him. He had a strength coach, me. He had a bunch of assistant basketball coaches, head basketball coaches, a lot of people that really cared about him. And he said it definitely pushed me to go harder, which ultimately made me better and helped me reach heights people on the outside previously didn't think I could reach. And he noted that some people work hard their whole college career and felt like their hard work was always going unnoticed by their coaches, which made them give up on a sport they loved. And he said he never had that feeling at Cortland. And he also said he ended up having a 10 times better college career than high school, which is the opposite for most people who play sports. So what I want you to do right now, I'll give you a few minutes to do this. Take a minute and think about the best coaches you've ever had, and then just write down what did they do. Write down and describe your best experience with working with a coach. So take a few minutes to do that, and then I think that you can raise your hand, and then I can just call you out and say, and you can chime in. If maybe your mic's not going on, I think you can actually type that in too. So take a minute, think about the best coaches you've ever had, and what did they do? Write that down, and then you can share that with me. I'll pause the recording for this part. Okay, can anyone share, whether that's talking or through typing in, just describe some of the best experiences you've had with a coach? Yeah, Will, I think you can just talk. Why don't you give that a try? Great, thank you. Yep, can you hear me? Great. All right, talk. Yep. Great. So you knew that your coach cared about you, not just as an athlete, but as a person. All right, awesome. Anyone else? You can just raise your hand and chime right in. Any other brave hands? Can't call you out like you're in class. Well, actually, I think I can. Who is in attendance? All right. I have a coach right now. How about Carson? Can you hear me, Carson? I can hear you. Can you tell me about your best experience with a coach? Maybe it's Jeff, maybe it's not. Yep. Great. So that individual attention. And then Sergio, I'm sorry, was that you that raised your hand? I know that someone raised their hand. It just popped up quick on my screen. Who raised their hand? You can raise your hand again. All right, no worries. All right, Kaylee. Yes, can you hear me? Go ahead, Kaylee. My coach made me feel like I have potential and believed in me. Where did that message go? Kaylee, can you speak? Or is your mic muted? Yep, I can hear you now. No, you got it. And then you write it down too. So you said my coach made me feel like I have potential and believed in the whole team holding everyone accountable. You want to dig into that a little bit more? Mm-hmm. That's really cool. Nice. So I'm gonna go to this next slide. So in self-determination theory, there's three basic human psychological needs, and that is autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So if I asked you the question, the question would be, I was there because I wanted to be. I can stick with you, Kaylee, in your sporting experience. Do you feel like you're on the team because you want to be there, right? Does anyone, and you can share this, did anyone play a sport maybe in high school or you're currently playing a sport in college where you almost dread going to practice because you're going there because of some other external motives. You're not going there, you're not excited about going there. Has anyone ever had that experience? Yeah, Will, you want to chime in on that? Mhm. Yep. Okay. And was the coach the deciding factor or the Okay. Great. And then what about competency? Did anyone ever have a coach where they made you feel non-competent, as in you didn't feel like you were improving? They were highlighting that you weren't really good at something. Has anyone had an experience like that? All right. What about the other way around, where your coach really focused on helping you improve your skills? Does anyone have an experience with a coach helping them do that? There must be someone in either camp. All right, and then Will, you actually already one. I think you said this. I think a lot of you mentioned this is relatedness, where you felt like your coach cared about you as a person first, and then also Kaylee, you said I felt involved and connected with my coach and teammates. So those are the three psychological needs in self-determination theory. So autonomy is people need to perceive that they have choices and that they can self-determine what they do. So that means they're doing what they're doing because they actually want to do it. Competency, people need to seek out and control the outcomes and also experience mastery. And then the last one is relatedness. So people need to care about and be cared about by others, and they need to feel connected without ulterior motives. Oh, that bottom slide didn't come out too well. So the application to this is that whether you're struggling to do a health behavior, I have exercise under here consistently, or if you actually are going to be prescribing behavior change. So let's say that you are going to be prescribing behavior change. Maybe you're going to be a strength coach, personal trainer, physical therapist, occupational therapist. One, you need to create an environment that provides those three basic psychological needs for the people that you're working with. And if you're struggling to do a health behavior consistently, you want to find an environment that actually provides you with autonomy, relatedness, and then competency. So now we'll move on to learn the differences between controlled and autonomous motivation. So I've shown you this slide before, where behavior is usually the result of capability, motivation, and then opportunity. So if we tease out this motivation component, we can get a little further into it. But first, what I want you to do is I want you to write down, we can, if it's easier, we can stick with exercise. Let's just stick with exercise for this. So let's say, why are you motivated to exercise? Stated otherwise, what are your motives to exercise? And I want you to list all the reasons. So same thing here. I will give you a few minutes. If you got a piece of paper right there, just write down, what are all your motives for exercising? All right, great. You can keep sending them in. Ricky wants to beat his friends. You can keep typing them in. All right, I think that's great. So you guys can pause here. So what self-determination theory does is it represents a broad framework for the study of human motivation. So now if you all are already exercising, at least to some extent, you're clearly not amotivated. Amotivation just refers to having no motivation at all. The other two types of motivation are extrinsic motivation and then intrinsic motivation. And we're going to really dig into different types of extrinsic motivation. And we'll take some of the answers that you wrote down right there. So again, we still have amotivation, extrinsic motivation, and then intrinsic motivation. We can also lump motivation into either controlled motivation or autonomous motivation. Now, extrinsic motivation can still be autonomous. Intrinsic motivation refers to doing something just for the sheer enjoyment of it. Does anyone here exercise just because they're doing it just because they like doing it. So a lot of you wrote down reasons why. I don't know if I saw anyone write down, I exercise because I like exercising. Can anyone just raise your hand if you exercise because you like exercising? Great. Got a lot of hands raised. All right. This beeping makes me feel like I just won money at a casino, but I didn't. And you shouldn't go to a casino right now. All right. So, great. Thanks for lowering your hands, guys. All right. So, it seems like a lot of you do exercise because you actually enjoy exercising. But a lot of you also wrote down, let's say, Sean, you said to be healthy. Elizabeth deals with stress. So a bunch of you also wrote deal with stress. Let's see. I think I saw Mike, you wrote down practice what you preach. So any motive that you have to exercise that's outside of I'm doing it just because I like doing it is still an extrinsic motivation. But there's going to be different kinds of extrinsic motivation. If you say that I'm exercising because I want to practice what I preach, then you value living up to some kind of identity that you have for yourself. Versus, I'm sure all of us have heard of someone who's exercising because the doctor told them that they needed to, or else they'd get sick, or maybe a significant other is telling them that they need to exercise with them. So, and people might be exercising because someone's telling them that they need to do it. So, again, if someone's telling you that you should be doing something and you do it because of that, that is more of a controlled form of extrinsic motivation. Versus if you're exercising because you value the health benefits, that's more of an autonomous form of extrinsic motivation. Okay, so autonomous motivation is a behavior is perceived to be consistent with intrinsic goals or outcomes and emanates from the self. You have a feeling a sense of choice, personal endorsement, interest, and satisfaction. And as a consequence, people are more likely to persist with that behavior. Whereas controlled motivation, it reflects engaging in behaviors for externally referenced reasons. Individuals feel a sense of obligation and pressure and are only likely to persist with the behavior as long as the external contingency is present. So if someone's nagging you to work out, and then you do work out, that's controlled motivation. And as soon as that person stops doing that, you're probably not going to exercise. Versus autonomous motivation really helps with persistence, because if you're exercising because, let's see, Sergio says to have clarity in his mindset, feel good, and then it's something that he has a passion for. Those rewards aren't going to go away because they come from within. Now, if we look at different exact motives, we can see that some motives line up with more controlled forms of motivation, and some map out to more autonomous forms of motivation. So, for example, this was a research study, I think it was in 2008, where if we look at, for example, an appearance motive, so if you're exercising because you want to look good, that's more of a controlled motive. Whereas if you're exercising because you enjoy the challenge, or if you're exercising because you enjoy the affiliation that comes along with exercise, those are more of autonomous motives. So, for example, an appearance motive, that would be controlled motivation. To gain reward or avoid punishment, that's a controlled motive. If you're exercising because you feel guilty, if you don't exercise, that's a controlled motive. If you're exercising to post something on Instagram, that's also a controlled motivation. Versus a person who values the health benefits, that's an autonomous motive. So is a person who enjoys the challenge, and then so is a person where exercise is actually a part of their identity. Those are all autonomous motives. So we take extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, and we can break extrinsic motivation down to controlled or autonomous. Intrinsic motivation is also autonomous motivation. And now there's different types of motivational regulations within extrinsic motivation. So we have external regulation, introjected regulation, identified regulation, and integrated regulation. So external regulation is when a behavior is occurring for so if we're getting external rewards or avoiding punishments, we're being compliant to something. Introjected regulation definitely has ego involvement. So if you're exercising and you're good at it, and you're exercising to show off how good you are, that's introjection. Identified regulation would be where you actually value the outcome of the behavior. So you might not love exercise, but you're doing it because you value what you get out of it. Integrated regulation refers to that the behavior is actually a part of your identity. So you're exercising because you're an exerciser, and that's what exercisers do. So you can type this in here in the chat box. I'm going to ask you 2 questions. Imagine that you have a person who is exercising just because they want to look better. We're going to call them person 2. And then you also have person 1. Person 1 wants to look better just like person 2 does, but they also value the health benefits of exercise. It's a part of their identity, and they also think that it's fun. Who do you think is going to persist longer in exercise, person 1 or person 2? You can just type that right into that chat box. Jamie, person 2? Yeah, I think you guys all got the point. Great. So person 1, even though they both have the same one single motive, person 1 is definitely going to be more persistent with exercise. Thanks for the Spanish, William. All right. So again, these are different forms of motives. So from your sheet, what I want you to do is write down where do your motivational regulations lie. So just remember. So you wrote down some of the reasons. Actually, let's do this together. Actually, no, I lied. Do it on your own, and then I'll ask some people to share. So what were the motives that you wrote down? And then try to identify where they are right here. So for example, if you said, let's see, deal with stress. So where would deal with stress fall right here? Okay, so take a few minutes. So for all of the motives that you wrote down, write down which form of regulation that you actually think it is. Is it intrinsic? Is it integrated, identified, introjected, or is it external regulation? So take a few minutes to do that. All right, so can someone give me an example of give me one motive that you had and what kind of behavioral regulation do you think it was? So you can just raise your hand if you want to share or if you can share. All right, Nikia, can you want to share a motive? I'm not sure if you're speaking. We can't hear you. You can always type it in the browser. All right, so you say health. Okay, so where do you think what motive do you think that is? Is it intrinsic, integrated, identified, introjected, or external? External regulation. I would argue against that. External regulation would be more like you're being forced to do it versus when you say health motive, I think of identified regulation because you actually value the outcome of the activity. So unless you're saying, for example, someone's forcing you to do it because you need to do it for your health, then that might be a little bit of a different conversation. Anyone else have another one that they are willing to share? Elena, go ahead. You can speak if we can hear you. All right, boost of endorphins. All right. Where do you think that one lies? Not inartistic, intrinsic. That's okay. So I would completely agree with you. So it's endorphins. I think of enjoyment, pleasure, and fun. Great, good answer. Anyone else? You're not inartistic. Anyone else? Anyone else? Going once, twice. All right, Michael. Thank you. You guys can talk too. You don't necessarily have to type it in. as long as your mics are not muted. Yep, I can hear you, Mike. Okay, so it's a part of you. What do you think that is? It could be. It sounded like you said even like whenever I hear it's a part of me, I think identity, which is a little bit more integrated. Does that make sense? Yeah, you might definitely be doing it for intrinsic reasons, but when I hear it's a part of who I am, um, I think of that. All right, I'm gonna move on to the next one. Okay, so raise your hand if you had any controlled motives. Like raise your hand if you're exercising because you feel guilty if you don't do it. Go ahead, just raise your hand. You don't need to say anything. All right, super. Now do this. Raise your hand if someone's ever dragged you along to exercise. Maybe you didn't want to go, but somebody was like, "Come on, let's do it." Raise your hand if someone ever dragged you along to do it. All right, great. So now we have this question of, is that a bad thing? Is controlled motivation all that bad? So, in a systematic review of self-determination theory in the exercise domain, a general finding was that autonomous regulation of physical activity was positively related to behavioral frequency, whereas controlled regulation had a negative or no relationship with exercise in published samples. But we really need to dig into that a little bit more. So, in a more recent research study in 2018, Phillips and Johnson found that an overall positive effect of autonomous regulation on physical activity levels, but they found a curvilinear effect, and I'll show you what that looks like, of controlled motivation on physical activity. So at all levels, when autonomous motivation went up, exercise also went up. It says I have poor connection right now. I hope you guys can hear me. So as autonomous regulation goes up, so do levels of exercise. But also when controlled motivation goes up slightly, exercise levels also go up as well. So I'll show you what that chart actually looks like. So if you look, I know it's an odd looking chart, but if you look at this side with autonomous regulation on this axis, we see that as autonomous motivation scores go up, exercise increases. If we also look at controlled motivation, we can see that at really high levels of controlled motivation, people don't exercise a lot. So if you think of a low or a high, a high controlled motivation score paired with a low autonomous motivation score, people really aren't exercising. They're not reporting a lot of minutes of exercise. But as we start to get a little bit towards the middle of our controlled regulation scores, we see that people actually do exercise. So again, as autonomous motivation goes up, exercise levels go up. But they also go up further when controlled motivation levels go up as well. So it's okay if somebody's exercising because they want to look good, but if that's their sole motive, maybe that's not so good. But if that's paired with their exercising because it's part of their identity, then that's probably a good thing. If somebody has, it's called more controlled forms of motivation too. The negative effects of having only controlled motivation can also be overcome by making solid plans. So we've talked about implementation intentions in this class. This research study, the researchers took two groups, people that were self-discordant. This is basically the same as saying they have controlled motivation, and there's self-concordance, which means they have autonomous motivation. And when people who had that controlled motivation formed plans, they actually exercised just as much as the people who made plans when they had more autonomous forms of motivation. So if someone's self-discordant or if someone has controlled motivation, they can still exercise, especially if that's supplemented with plans. So the point is that a behavior can occur due to any of these behavioral regulations. So now we'll talk about learning how providing basic psychological needs can help people improve their autonomous motivation. So the first thing is that any motive is a hook. If somebody has a New Year's resolution and they want to lose 20 pounds, that's great. That's a hook. That will get them going for a little bit. It might not get them going forever, but this is where providing their basic psychological needs is important. So Edward Deci, Dr. Deci is one of the founders of self-determination theory. So he works at the University of RIT, Rochester. I think no, some school in Rochester. He works, I think it's University of Rochester, which actually happens to be close to where I live. So I did get a chance to go and meet him. I think that was about 2 years ago over Thanksgiving break, and I said, how do we get people to move from more controlled motivation to more autonomous forms of motivation? And the answer really is you need to provide them with all three of their basic psychological needs. This is how we facilitate long-term motivation. We make sure that people are feeling autonomous, that they feel competent, and that they feel like you actually care about them as a coach. So I'll give you some examples of what happens when you take away an athlete's, or in this case it's an athlete's or a client's basic psychological needs. So in this case, I was talking to a former athlete, a volleyball player, who was presumably autonomously motivated to play volleyball before going into college. And what she told me is that they're all struggling, exhausted, burnout, already tried practice instead of looking forward to it. And they literally count down the minutes until practice is over, and it's horrible. And so this was all the doing of a coach. The coach took someone who was autonomously motivated and made them have more of a controlled form of motivation. And this happened because they took away this athlete's three basic psychological needs. So if we look at this, they didn't feel like they wanted to be there. The coach didn't make them feel competent, and the coach didn't show that they actually cared about that person. And then here's an opposite example. This is an athlete that I had. He was a basketball player, did not love weight training. When he came to school, this was a message he sent to me when I had left school to come to Boston. He was saying exactly, you've been the best trainer I've ever had, and that was the best part. So he went from actually not liking being in the weight room to actually valuing the outcome of it. So again, just to reiterate, that providing somebody with their three basic psychological needs is going to be very important for facilitating maintenance. Okay, so now let's talk about, we're going to assess ways to apply self-determination theory concepts to coaching exercise. All right. So if we want to provide autonomy, we need to provide autonomy supportive coaching. In order to enhance competency, we need to provide people with informational feedback. And in order to demonstrate relatedness, we need to build community and then also culture. So this is just restating what I just said. Okay, so now for actual definitions of these. So relatedness refers to feeling connected and involved with others and having a sense of belonging. It's experience both in being cared about and in caring. So the application of that is we want to build community and build culture, or if you are looking for a place, you want to find community and culture. So essentially we want to find a place where people care about you, or build a place where you care about people. So now if you ever walk into a commercial gym, this is probably the scene that you would see. You're not going to see much community or culture in a commercial gym. And this is not a knock on a commercial gym at all, but it's not exactly something that's going to be facilitating long-term maintenance versus an environment like this. So this is actually a gym in downtown Boston. It's called AMP. This is one of my friends owns this gym. So if I'm just looking at this, which one demonstrates community more? This one or this one? In my mind, it's definitely this one. I think CrossFit does a great job of facilitating community, and that's why it's been so popular. This was a running club that I used to be in, so I think running clubs are another great example of ways to facilitate community around exercise. I'll send you guys the link of this video, but this is from one of my friends, Marc Fisher. He owns a gym in New York City. So I'll send out a link to that. But he just talks about facilitating or actually building community. And I also like this term too. It's called the third space. So the third space is considered a communal space that's separate from home or work. It's a place where a client could experience their own sense of identity and relationships to others. There should be a playful mood, and clients should feel like the gym is their home away from home. So you can raise your hand for this one. Does anyone feel like the gym that they go to is actually their home away from home? As in, like, you have home, Michael, good. So we can think of, you have your home and you have your work, and your third space is that other space that feels like home to you. Anna, you also feel like that? So gym is the third space. Anyone else? All right, moving on. Autonomy. So individuals need to experience self-endorsement over their own actions. So I want you to picture two people, or actually, let's just do this. Let's say at the beginning of this class, I said, you all need to run a marathon. Uh, you need to run a marathon, or else you're not going to pass this class. Um, if you run a marathon, you're going to pass this class. Raise your hand if you would do the marathon. If I said if you don't do it, you're going to fail the class. Raise your hand if you would do the marathon. It's past drop add too, so sorry. Let's add that. All right, some of you might take the hit. So, all right, great. You can lower your hands now. My guess is all of you would do it. Let's just say there's no time constraint on it. You just have to cross the finish line. Okay, so that's situation number one. You're clearly not doing this out of any kind of autonomous motive. You're doing it because you feel forced to do it. But here's another scenario to think about. Imagine that you went out for a run, and felt good. You enjoyed it, and then maybe you've been doing that for a while, and then you end up finding a 5K, a group that goes out, runs for 5Ks every Monday, and you join that group, and it feels good. So you've been doing it for a while, and then someone in the 5K group says, "Hey, we're running a half marathon. You should do this with us." So you start training with them to do a half marathon. You do the half marathon. You're impressed that you were able to do it, and then maybe that same person comes up to you and says, "Hey, we're gonna do a marathon in 6 months. You want to train with us to do it?" And you say, "Yeah, I'd like to do that." So then 6 months from now, you cross the finish line. You've done the marathon. Um, think about those two different scenarios, and you can type that in. Which one do you think someone's going to feel better about? Situation one, where you're going to fail if you don't do it, or that situation two that I just described. So which one do you think is going to feel more autonomous, situation one or two? Great. I completely agree with you. Situation two. So we have the same exact behavior, but people are doing it for different motives. So in that first situation, that was entirely external regulation, versus maybe you're actually starting to move towards more intrinsic motivation. And then I'll tell you guys a client story that I had. So this is Kathy. Kathy was someone that I trained back at Cortland. Kathy has cerebral palsy, which means that it's a motor control disease. So she walked with a cane prior to, but she had been through a string of different trainers, and all these trainers were trying to fix her, which they just didn't understand that you can't fix cerebral palsy. So I asked her why she actually enjoyed training with me. And this is what she had said. She said, "You were successful because you listened, you adopted a collaborative approach, you worked with me to meet my goals, and you knew my goals were what mattered. Many trainers wanted to work on my gait or foot drop. Think about that. If those things were fixable, a more educated and intelligent professional would have done that years ago. With your help, I was finally able to do what I've always wanted to, lift heavy weights, be fit, and feel good." And she added in, "and as you know, look fantastic." So I think a big part of coaching and providing autonomy-based support is to don't ever tell people what they can't do. it's to find out what they actually can do. So when Kathy said, I want to be able to do a pull up, I was like, okay, let's figure this out. So with her, it was in her left hand, there was a grip issue. So she struggled to actually get a good grip on her left hand. She's like, I want to do curls, I want to do deadlifts. So it was all about actually just figuring out what she could do. And she also added this into, she said, I know it sounds like overkill, but the training is critical to my quality of life. It's easier to fit in with physical activity specialists when they see my biceps before my cane. It's credibility. Personally, I'm able to live my life the way I want to, not have to worry about falling apart from secondary disabilities, which I should have plenty of. And she said it provides a sense of control over my own health and well-being, and that in and of itself is life-changing. And then at the time, she said, heck, I'm in New Zealand, traveling solo and living it up. So this is the kind of results that you can get when you coach with Autonomy Sport. And this is a picture of her actually doing a deadlift and standing up on her own. So we just modified it. We did it off of blocks instead of doing it off the floor. And this is something that my friend Nick Timonello said. He said, if exercise is medicine, then we're much more likely to take our daily dose when it tastes good. So find a form of exercise that you enjoy. So if somebody is like, I don't like doing squats, that's fine. If I were to force specific exercises on people that they don't like doing, then I'm taking their autonomy away. So never make people do things that they don't want to actually do. So the application of that is to, one, find out what the person's goal and why is it also meaningful to them. Don't force people to do things that they don't want to do. And we want to find a way to help people accomplish their goal rather than tell them that they cannot accomplish their goal. So we're really trying to find out what people can do. So now we'll move on to competency. So I found this title a while back where it's half of Americans battle gym intimidation of working out in front of others. So I think a lot of that's a competency issue. So competency just means it's very, very similar to self-efficacy. It's basically the same thing. It's feeling effective in one's interactions with the social environment, that is experiencing opportunities and support for the exercise, expansion, and expression of one's capabilities and talents. Where individuals are prevented from developing skills, understanding, or mastery, the competency need will go unmet. So how can coaches promote competency for exercises? One is we always want to meet clients where they're at, and we don't want to actually highlight dysfunction. I see a lot of coaches do this, where they tell people everything that's wrong with them, versus where we don't want to do that. We want to help them improve. So we want to provide informational feedback to help clients or athletes develop their skills. And then the big key is to also make sure you're highlighting improvements. Raise your hand if you've heard of the placebo effect. Can anyone try to describe what the placebo effect is? You can say it out. Raise your hand if you want to just give a go at what the placebo effect is. Matt, Dean, go ahead. What's the placebo effect? Can you hear me, Dean? Yeah, you can say it in the chat. That's fine. Yeah, either one's fine. Whatever you'd like, Dean. Yeah. What do you think the placebo effect is? Mm-hmm. Yeah, perfect. So yeah, a placebo effect is when an inert substance causes a positive effect. Okay. So can anyone take a stab at what they think what the nocebo effect is? We have placebo and then we have a nocebo effect. So placebo, an inert substance causing positive effects. What do you think a nocebo is? Go ahead, you can raise your hand if you want to take a stab at it. Yeah, Matt. Um, That might, I actually don't know what the term of that is, because I think what you're saying is we're presuming that the thing actually should work and it doesn't work, right? So a nocebo is actually something, it's the exact opposite of a placebo. It's an inert substance that causes harm. So the placebo is something that shouldn't do anything, but it causes benefits. And then nocebo is something that shouldn't do anything. It's an inert substance, but causes negative effects. Um, so words can actually be a nocebo. I've seen this happen with the placebo effect for words in training all the time. If someone's like, "Oh, my knee hurts when I do this exercise," and you say, "Hey, it should feel better if you actually just do a reverse lunge instead of a forward lunge." I mean, that does technically take a lot of stress off the joint, but they're like, "Oh yeah, that feels so much better." Words as a nocebo effect would be if you told somebody after an assessment with them that they were broken or damaged, or if you said anything that made them feel like a failure, while words technically have no real effect, um, what you say can actually have detrimental effects. And when I say no effect, I mean it's an inert substance. It's not something that actually changes your body chemistry. But if someone constantly tells someone else that they're not good at this or they're wrong and everything like that, then that's gonna be very discouraging. So we want to make sure that we don't ever get into that nocebo territory. So how would we promote competency if we're still talking about exercise? One is we want to take what someone's goals are and have their abilities match where their goals are. So if we're talking about exercise, we want correct exercise selection. We want positive informational feedback. If somebody has a weight loss goal, we need to match whatever they're doing with what they feel like their current abilities are. So if somebody doesn't feel like they can eat vegetables with each meal, even if their goal is to lose weight, okay, so then how can we match that with what you feel like your current abilities actually are in the moment? Okay, so this is just recapping everything that we went over. Um, One, there are three basic psychological needs. That is perceived autonomy, perceived competency, and relatedness. Um, if you provide people with their basic psychological needs, this can help them become more autonomously motivated. There is extrinsic and intrinsic forms of motivation. Intrinsic motivation just relates to doing something because it's enjoyable or fun or pleasurable, whereas there's a wide variety of extrinsic motives. So the ones listed up here, we have external regulation, introjected regulation, identified regulation, and integrated regulation. Your identified regulation and integrated regulation, those are autonomous forms of external motivation, whereas controlled forms of external motivation are that external regulation, and then also introjected regulation. So what I want you to do, maybe we can start, just at least get this going right here before I let you all go. Um, can you just raise your hand if you were able to open up that Excel sheet that I sent you? Okay, great, great. So what I would like you to do is I'll go through these questions and then just write them down. All right. So you actually already went through some of this. I want you to discuss this with your partner on the phone. So one, you're gonna do that best experience with a coach. So let's also add in best experience with a coach, and then also let's add in worst experience with a coach, and then you can talk about what are some of the common characteristics. Okay. And then what I want you to write down, because the person that you're talking with, this is gonna be, you guys are gonna be coaching each other. So talk about what you would like to get out of a coaching experience as the client. So what are you trying to change? How do you want your coach to actually help you? All right. So what would you like to get out of the Dean? Did you have a question? No, you lowered your hand. Okay, we're lowering our hands. All right, cool. So what would you like to get out of this experience? Uh, okay, you're good, Dean. Okay. So then also just in terms of why are you motivated to actually change your behavior? So whatever your goal was that you wrote about that in that individual assignment was, why are you motivated to change your behavior? What are your motives specifically? And then from that, where do those motivational regulations lie? So that's all on a spectrum. So I will post this to Blackboard actually as soon as we get done so that you have access to this. So just a real quick recap. Talk about your best and worst coaching experiences. What do you want to get out of working with a coach, which is your partner? In terms of what you want to change, why are you motivated to change, and then what are your motives? So I know some of you might have wrote down I want to read more. Okay, so why do you want to read more, and what kind of motive is that? So where do those motivational regulations actually lie? So let me post this to Blackboard right now so that you can see it. Does anyone have any questions right now? You can raise your hand if you do, or you can just type it right in. That's fine as well. Okay. So if you don't have any questions right now, what I would do is text. Is that no? That's an email. So what I would do is I would text your partner and just make sure that they were actually in this class so they know what you're supposed to be talking about. I did record over this lecture, so if they're not here, you can hold off on that conversation until they watch the entirety of this lecture. I'm going to pause that right now.